Today's video is brought to you by Squarespace. Have you been looking for a platform to build your brand and grow your business online? Well, look no further than Squarespace. It's the perfect solution to help you stand out with a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and even sell anything you want. From products to content, whatever you want, you can sell it through Squarespace. Plus, it's got amazing features. There's a member areas feature where you can sell exclusive content. And also they've got email campaigns that allow you to create custom email templates that match your brand's look and feel and then send them out to all of your email subscribers. Plus, a built-in analytics feature that allows you to track the impact of each email you send. Further, if you're passionate about a cause, Squarespace makes it easy to gather contributions through PayPal, Apple Pay, Stripe, and Venmo with its Collect Donations feature. You can even customize the donation form to match your brand style and messaging. And that's not all. Squarespace offers blogging tools that are powerful and easy to use. You can share stories, photos, videos, and updates with your audience, categorize your posts, and even schedule them to go live at specific times. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/brainfood to save 10% of your first purchase of a website or a domain. So what are you waiting for? Get started with Squarespace today and take your brand to the next level. And now, today's video. Look at this image and tell me what you see. Perhaps you see two elephants in red hats high-fiving with their trunks, or a pair of gnomes playing patty cake, or maybe it looks more like a human pelvis, or a big fish about to swallow you, or your parents screaming at each other because they can't agree on anything except that their son is a disappointment because he decided to make YouTube videos instead of becoming a doctor. Along with the Freudian analyst's couch and endless jokes about loving one's mother, the Rorschach int block test has become one of the most recognizable symbols of psychology and a cultural icon in its own right, inspiring countless works of art from paintings to music videos and even a masked vigilante in the comic book series Watchmen. Yet even 100 years after its creation, the workings of the test itself remain poorly understood by the general public. Can a series of ink blots on paper actually reveal a person's innermost thoughts and personalities and help diagnose mental illness? If so, how is the test actually scored? And is the test even used anymore? Or has the Rorschach gone the way of bloodletting, phrenology, lobotomies, and other promising but discredited psychological tools of yesteryear? Well, let's dig deeper into our collective psyches and find out, shall we? While the Rorschach test is most closely associated with its namesake, Swiss psychiatrist Herman Rorschach, the idea of using ambiguous images to evaluate people's personality, thought process, and other psychological attributes predates Rorschach by several decades. In 1895, psychologist Alfred Binet, developer of the first practical IQ test, considered including ink blots in his first intelligence test for French schoolchildren in order to evaluate their visual creativity. 4 years later, psychologist Stella Sharp published a study in which participants were asked to freely interpret a set of 10 ink blots, reporting that a particular blot may call up in the mind of a subject through association a number of objects similar to this in form, and he enumerates the objects one after another, while to another individual the same blot seems filled with pictures representing some action or situation, which are reported often with touches of fancy or sentiment. Over the following decade, similar studies were conducted by researchers such as E.A. Kirkpatrick, Guy Whipple, F.C. Bartlett, and Cicely Parsons. However, these experiments were largely focused on evaluating creativity in children. It would not be until 1911 that ink blots would be applied to the diagnosis of mental illness. And enter the picture, Herman Rorschach. Herman Rorschach was born on November 8, 1884 in Zurich, Switzerland, the eldest of 3 children born to Ulrich Rorschach, a self-employed art teacher, and his wife Philippine. As a boy, Rorschach was obsessed with a popular game, Klexography, which involved creating inkblot figures and writing short stories or poems based on the results. So obsessed, in fact, that his school friends nicknamed him Klex. After graduating from high school, Rorschach struggled to choose between a career in the arts or in the sciences, and wrote to the great German biologist Ernst Haeckel for advice. Unsurprisingly, Haeckel advocated for science, and in 1904, Rorschach enrolled in geology and botany at the Académie de Neuchâtel. After only a single term, however, he switched streams and enrolled in medicine at the University of Zurich. For his residency, Rorschach took a job as a first assistant at the Cantonal Mental Hospital in Herisau, where he worked and completed his doctoral dissertation under psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler. An influential figure in early psychology, Bleuler had mentored the great psychoanalyst Carl Jung and coined the term schizophrenia, meaning split mind, to describe the group of psychotic disorders previously known as dementia praecox. The theories of Bleuler, Jung, and Sigmund Freud about the subconscious mind had a profound impact on Rorschach, who soon began connecting the ideas of psychoanalysis with his favorite childhood game, Following the footsteps of Binet, Sharp, Kirkpatrick, and others, in 1911, Rorschach began using ink blots to evaluate creativity in schoolchildren, experiments that would form the basis of a doctoral dissertation. Out of curiosity, Rorschach also administered the tests to some of the patients at Herisau Hospital. Observing that patients with schizophrenia gave very different responses from those with other diagnoses, he began to wonder whether ink blots could be used to profile and diagnose different psychiatric disorders. Between 1917 and 1920, Rorschach experimented with nearly 40 different ink blots, recording the responses of 288 mentally ill and 117 healthy individuals, including nurses and medical students. Eventually, he narrowed these down to a set of 15 standard ink blots, which he determined to be most useful for diagnosis. Contrary to popular belief, the standard Rorschach ink blots were not randomly generated by dripping ink on paper and folding it in half, at least not entirely. Rather, Rorschach used his artistic skills to refine and enhance the contours of each blot to make them as ambiguous and evocative as possible. In 1921, Rorschach published his findings in a book titled Psychodiagnostik, which included not only the ink blots but carefully constructed diagnostic criteria and scoring systems for evaluating patients' responses. However, due to printing costs, the publisher forced Rorschach to cut his set of 15 ink blots down to 10, the standard number used ever since. In modern psychiatric terms, Rorschach's system is a type of projective test, like the equally popular word association and sentence completion tests. The brain, being a rationalizing organ, will attempt to impose order and logic upon ambiguous stimuli, for example by translating random neural impulses during sleep into seemingly coherent dreams, or making us see faces or other familiar shapes in clouds, a phenomenon known as pareidolia. Thus, Rorschach reasoned, by analyzing a person's interpretation of ambiguous image, like an ink blot, one could evaluate their mental processes and determine if they were suffering from a cognitive or thought disorder like schizophrenia. As mentioned, the standard Rorschach test consists of 10 symmetrical ink blot cards, 5 black, 2 black and red, and 3 full color. In a typical evaluation, the respondent is handed the cards one at a time and asked by the examiner, "What might this be?" The respondent is allowed to interpret the images however they please, to give as many responses as they want, and hold the images in any orientation. Once the respondent has gone through the entire set, the examiner asks them to look through the blots again and explain what images they saw and which features led them to those conclusions. Properly performed, a Rorschach test takes about an hour and a half to administer and score. Once all the respondents' answers have been noted, the examiner then evaluates them according to a set of specific criteria. While the ink blots are intended to be ambiguous and infinitely interpretable, Rorschach and subsequent psychologists compiled statistics on the most common responses by healthy respondents. For example, cards 1 and 5 are most commonly interpreted as a bat or a moth, 2 and 3 as humans, 4 and 6 as an animal hide or rug, 7 and 9 as a pair of human faces, 8 as a pair of four-legged animals, and 10 as a group of animals including crabs, lobsters, snakes, and spiders. Extreme deviation from these common responses may indicate disordered thinking, though it may also merely indicate that the respondent is highly creative. In addition, particular features of certain cards can trigger specific responses which can indicate underlying psychological issues. For example, the splashes of red in card 2 can be interpreted as blood, possibly indicating repressed violent or sexual urges, while a respondent's interpretation of the 2 humanoid figures in card 3 can reveal how they relate to and interact with other people. Following Rorschach's method, responses are evaluated according to 3 scoring categories: content, location, and determinants. Content refers to the specific objects described by the respondent, such as natural features, animals, human bodies or features, fictional or mythical figures, or imagery relating to sex. Location refers to how much of an ink blot or which specific parts the respondent used to form an image, and is broken down into 4 categories: W for the whole ink blot, D for a commonly described part of the ink blot, D for an uncommonly described part or unusual detail of the ink blot, and S for the white space around the ink blot. Finally, determinants are the particular attributes of the ink blot that the respondent reacted to, and are grouped into 5 categories: form, movement, color, shading, and pairs and reflections. Responses by patients with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder often exhibit poor form quality, with the images reported by these patients not fitting the actual shape of the ink blots. In addition to these categories, examiners must also take into account the respondent's behavior during the examination itself, consistent or repeated themes and responses across responses, and other circumstantial details. For example, quick, confident responses typically indicate ease with others and comfort with social interactions and unfamiliar situations. But as this brief summary should make clear, scoring and evaluating a Rorschach test is a very complex process requiring a great deal of knowledge, experience, and care on the part of the examiner. The Rorschach test is also never the sole diagnostic tool used by a psychiatrist, and is always combined with a variety of other tests. In the first few years after its introduction, the Rorschach test remained relatively unknown outside of a small circle of psychoanalysts. In 1927, however, American psychiatrist David Levy brought the Rorschach test to the United States and introduced it to his graduate student Samuel Beck. Beck, along with German psychiatrist Bruno Klopfer, who hailed the Rorschach test as an X-ray of the mind, became one of the test's greatest apostles, popularizing its use around the world and developing his own scoring system in 1937. By the 1940s, the Rorschach test had become the most widely used projective test in the world and a staple of nearly every psychiatrist's toolkit. Sadly, Herman Rorschach would not live to see his creation become an icon of the psychiatric profession. Less than a year after publishing his landmark work, he died of a ruptured appendix at the age of only 37. The Rorschach test's first public baptism of fire would come in 1945, when American psychiatrist Douglas Kelly and psychologist Gustav Gilbert administered the test to accused Nazi war criminals at the Nuremberg trials. As the world reeled at the unprecedented horrors of the Holocaust, Kelly and Gilbert saw the trials as a unique opportunity to determine if there was a particular Nazi pathology that led the defendants to commit atrocities. Among the defendants interviewed were Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe Robert Ley, head of the German Labour Front Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, and Julius Streicher, publisher of the Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer. Their responses, and the examiner's interpretation of those responses, say much about what the Rorschach test was intended to reveal. For example, Goering interpreted card number 2 as two dancing men, a fantastic dance. Two men, here are their heads, their hands together, are like whirling dervishes, here are their bodies, their feet. Florence Meyer and Richard Selzer, the psychologists who later evaluated Kelly and Gilbert's notes, claimed this response reflected a hypermanic defense, indicative of bipolar disorder, as well as the emptiness of Goering's being and an emotional preoccupation with status. They, on the other hand, reported seeing strange images like the jaws of a butterfly, which the examiners linked to his history of head injuries. Streicher, meanwhile, gave responses with a distinctly revolutionary theme, interpreting card number 2 as two women in French Revolutionary times with Jacobean caps, while Hess reported seeing a microscopic cross-section, parts of an insect with blood spots, a mask, a highly unusual response, which likely pointed to an underlying thought disorder. Surprisingly, however, Kelly and Gilbert came to very different conclusions when it came to the Nuremberg defendants' psychology. While Gilbert denounced the Nazi leadership were all demonic psychopaths, Kelly was forced to conclude that war criminal behavior exists on a continuum, and it's likely that many people would stoop to such behavior in certain circumstances. In other words, there was no Nazi pathology. The Nazi leadership were, by and large, ordinary men led to commit extraordinary acts of evil by a combination of circumstances. It was among the first articulations of the banality of evil that philosopher Hannah Arendt would so vividly describe during the trial of Adolf Eichmann 15 years later. But while the Nuremberg trials helped make the Rorschach test famous, they also laid bare some of its fundamental weaknesses and limitations. For instance, Gilbert and Kelly's diametrically opposed interpretations of the defendant's pathology reveals how truly subjective the tests can be. Furthermore, as American psychiatrist Joel Dimsdale explains, the test is heavily dependent on the context in which it is administered and the personal biases of the examiner. Who knows what is a strange response in a jailed cabinet minister facing a death sentence? And if you knew the inkblot record came from a Nazi war criminal, could you possibly interpret it dispassionately? Still, the Rorschach test continued to grow in popularity, with many psychologists, including Samuel Beck, Bruno Klopfer, Margaret Hertz, David Report, and Zygmunt Piotrowski, developing their own unique scoring systems. By the 1970s, however, the sheer number of scoring systems had grown confusing and unwieldy, and efforts were made to compile them into a single, cohesive, standardized system. The most successful of these was undertaken by American psychologist John Exner, who in 1974 published the Exner system of scoring, also known as the comprehensive system. To this day, the Exner system remains the most widely accepted standard method for scoring Rorschach tests, which is still used in a wide variety of settings, including schools, hospitals, and correctional facilities. In recent years, however, the Rorschach test has attracted considerable criticism, with many psychiatrists and psychologists dismissing it as anachronistic, overly subjective, and diagnostically useless. Much of this criticism has focused on two accusations: that the test lacks reliability and that it has poor validity. Reliability refers to a test's ability to yield identical or similar results regardless of who is administering the test. As we have seen, the test's inherent subjectivity means that different examiners can reach wildly different conclusions even when evaluating the same respondent. Validity, on the other hand, refers to a test's ability to measure what it aims to measure. Critics claim that the Rorschach test is too vague in what it actually seeks to measure to make it diagnostically useful, pointing to statistical data showing its unreliability in diagnosing anxiety, depression, and personality disorders. They also argue that examiners are far too eager to read psychoses into respondents' answers. In his 2003 book, What's Wrong with the Rorschach, psychology professor Scott Lilienfeld reveals that in many studies, nearly half of normal respondents are labeled as having distorted thinking, a false positivity rate he condemns as unacceptably high. For these and other reasons, many psychologists have called for the Rorschach test to be declared pseudoscience and retired, or at the very least that a moratorium be placed on its use until its validity and diagnostic utility can be more thoroughly studied. Part of the problem is that over the years, the Rorschach test has been applied to areas of psychiatry that its creator never intended. For example, since 1939, the test has been widely used as a general-purpose personality test, a use Herman Rorschach was highly skeptical of. By contrast, when used as intended for identifying the disordered thought typical of psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, research overwhelmingly shows the Rorschach test to have a high level of validity. It's also applicable to other areas of psychology, though to a far lesser extent. For example, the Rorschach can be used in evaluating broad personality traits such as one's sense of self-worth, depression, inadequate coping, problem-solving deficits, and psychopathy. It can also be used as a crude measure of intelligence, though in this application the examiner doesn't evaluate what the respondent sees, but rather the vocabulary that they use to describe what they see. While more purpose-built intelligence tests like the Stanford Binet are significantly more powerful, the Rorschach test can still be useful in certain circumstances, such as evaluating an uncooperative or hyperactive child. Finally, the Rorschach test can be used to identify patients with organic brain injuries caused by physical trauma, stroke, or cancer, who tend to take longer to respond to the ink blot card or give repetitive responses. But even when administered within these limitations, the Rorschach test suffers from another fundamental flaw. It's become too famous. For many decades after their creation, the standard Rorschach ink blots were kept relatively secret so as not to contaminate the test results. However, in 1983, American author William Poundstone published the book Big Secrets, in which he not only revealed the ink blot designs, but also the standard evaluation method and stock answers that people could use so not to appear psychotic. Psychiatrists decried the book, claiming that it would allow patients to cheat on the test and invalidate the results. A similar controversy erupted in 2009 when the 10 ink blots were uploaded to the Wikipedia article on the Rorschach test. Unfortunately, given the current landscape of digital information exchange and the fact that the Rorschach ink blots are public domain in most countries, this is one genie that likely can't be put back in the bottle. In conclusion, while the Rorschach test is far from the X-ray of the mind touted by its early adherents, when properly administered by a trained examiner and combined with other tests, even 100 years on, the iconic ink blots remain a valuable tool in the psychiatrist's toolkit.